The night that changed everything. Robert adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes lingering on his own reflection for a brief moment. The lines of fatigue etched into his face told the story of sleepless nights and relentless days. The early evening sun cast a warm glow over the city streets, painting the urban sprawl in hues of gold and amber. The familiar hum of traffic surrounded him, a backdrop to his thoughts as he navigated the labyrinthine roads. Life as a taxi driver was a delicate balancing act. It provided just enough income to keep the roof over his and his daughter's heads, but the weight of unpaid bills never truly left his mind. His daughters, Emily and Sophie, were his world. Their smiles were the only thing keeping him going when exhaustion crept into his bones. The day had been unremarkable so far. Passengers came and went, lost in their own worlds, an elderly man clutching groceries, a teenage girl glued to her phone, a middle-aged couple arguing softly. As dusk fell, Robert parked by the curb near a bustling cafe, sipping coffee from a thermos to fend off the chill of the evening. The city's energy was shifting, the daylight crowd giving way to the nocturnal rhythm of nightlife. Just as he was about to start his car and take another ride request, his phone buzzed. The pickup location was nearby, a quiet residential street, and the destination was a hospital. Robert accepted the ride without hesitation, unaware that this trip would alter the course of his life. When he arrived, the sight of the woman standing under a flickering street lamp stopped him in his tracks. She was visibly pregnant, clutching her swollen belly with one hand while the other clutched a small bag. Her expression was a mixture of fear and determination. Robert quickly stepped out of the car to assist her. "Take your time," he said gently, offering his arm to steady her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft but strained. The woman, Ruby, climbed into the back seat, her movements deliberate and cautious. As the car started moving, the silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. Robert didn't pry. He had learned to let passengers share their stories on their own terms. However, it wasn't long before Ruby broke the silence. I think my water just broke," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel as adrenaline surged through him. "Don't worry," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'll get you to the hospital." The urgency in the air was palpable. The city's usual traffic now felt like an obstacle course, but Robert navigated it with razor-sharp focus. Ruby's labored breathing filled the cab, each sound a reminder of the fragility of the moment. Time seemed to slow as he maneuvered through congested intersections and narrow streets, every second feeling like an eternity. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Robert sprang into action, flagging down a nurse and helping Ruby into a wheelchair. As the medical staff whisked her away, Ruby turned back for a brief moment. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice trembling with emotion. Robert stood there, watching as she disappeared through the hospital's sliding doors. A sense of relief washed over him, but it was tinged with unease. He had done his part, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. Returning to his cab, Robert sank into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel as he processed what had just happened. He glanced at the time. There were still hours left in his shift, but the night had already taken on a surreal quality. As he drove through the city, the usual buzz of activity seemed muted. The image of Ruby, vulnerable yet resolute, stayed with him. He couldn't stop wondering about her. Was she alone? Did she have anyone waiting for her? These questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside, knowing he had no answers. When his shift finally ended, Robert returned home to his modest house. The porch light flickered, a small beacon in the darkness. Inside, the house was silent, save for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Emily and Sophie were fast asleep in their shared room, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the chaos Robert had experienced earlier. Before heading to bed, Robert paused by their door, watching them for a moment. He whispered a silent promise to himself, a vow to keep fighting for them, no matter how hard life became. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressed down on him. He had helped bring someone to safety, but the encounter had stirred something deeper within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Little did he know, the events of that night were just the beginning. A storm was brewing, one that would test his resilience and redefine the course of his life. The city outside continued its restless rhythm, but for Robert, the wheels of change had already been set in motion. The chase begins. The morning sun rose over the city, bathing its streets in golden light. Robert's small home was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He sat at the table, sipping coffee, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. Ruby's face flashed in his memory. Her fear, her determination, and her quiet "thank you" before being whisked away. Emily and Sophie stumbled sleepily into the room, dragging their school bags behind them. Their innocent chatter filled the space, momentarily pulling Robert out of his thoughts. "Are you coming to the school play next week, Dad?" Sophie asked, her wide eyes brimming with hope. Robert smiled at her, though the thought of taking time off weighed on him. "Of course, sweetheart. Wouldn't miss it for the world." Emily, the older and more reserved of the two, gave him a knowing look. She had heard his late-night conversations with bill collectors. "It's okay if you can't make it," she said softly. Robert reached out, ruffling her hair. "I'll be there," he assured her, though doubt loomed in his mind. After dropping the girls off at school, he started his day behind the wheel. The usual stream of passengers came and went, but Robert couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering from the night before. He hadn't thought about checking on Ruby until now. Something about her vulnerability stuck with him. What if she had no one to help her? By mid-morning, Robert decided to make a quick stop at the hospital. It wasn't on his route, and he wasn't sure what he would find, but his instincts urged him to go. When he arrived, he parked near the entrance and walked into the lobby, his work boots echoing on the polished floors. "Excuse me," he asked the receptionist. "I dropped off a woman here last night. She was pregnant and in labor. Her name is Ruby. Is she okay?" The receptionist looked up, her brow furrowed slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out patient information." Robert nodded, disappointment washing over him. "I understand. I just wanted to make sure she's all right." As he turned to leave, a voice called out behind him, "Are you Robert?" He spun around to see a man approaching, his strides quick and purposeful. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a stern expression that softened slightly as he drew closer. "Yes, I'm Robert," he replied cautiously. The man extended his hand. "I'm Jack, Ruby's husband." Robert shook his hand, noting the firm grip. "How is she? How's the baby?" Jack's face broke into a smile, and the tension in his shoulders eased. "They're both fine, thanks to you. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if you hadn't gotten her here so quickly." Relief flooded Robert, but before he could respond, Jack's expression darkened. He glanced around the lobby as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Jack asked. Robert hesitated but nodded, following Jack to a quiet corner of the hospital's cafe. As they sat down, Jack leaned forward, his voice low. "I need to ask you something," Jack began, his tone serious. "Did anyone follow you last night?" The question caught Robert off guard. "Follow me? No, not that I noticed." "Why?" Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want to alarm you, but I think someone's been watching us. Before Ruby went into labor, I noticed a man on a motorcycle near our apartment. He seemed to be keeping his distance, but it didn't feel right." Robert frowned. "Did he follow you here?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "I haven't seen him since last night, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there." The conversation unsettled Robert. He had encountered his fair share of odd passengers and tense situations in his years as a taxi driver. But this felt different, more personal. As Jack thanked him again and returned to Ruby's room, Robert left the hospital, his mind racing. He wanted to believe that Jack's concerns were unfounded, but a nagging feeling in his gut told him otherwise. The rest of the day passed uneventfully until late in the afternoon, when Robert noticed something unusual. While driving through a busy intersection, he caught a glimpse of a motorcycle in his rearview mirror. The rider was wearing a black helmet and seemed to be keeping pace with him, weaving through traffic effortlessly. At first, Robert dismissed it as coincidence. Motorcycles were common in the city, after all. But as the hours passed, the same motorcycle appeared again and again, always lingering a few cars behind him. By nightfall, Robert was certain he was being followed. His heart pounded as he took a sharp turn down a narrow alley, hoping to lose the rider. When he emerged onto another street, the motorcycle was nowhere to be seen. Relief was short-lived. As Robert pulled into his driveway that night, the sound of a revving engine reached his ears. He turned to see the motorcycle parked at the end of the block, the rider motionless, staring in his direction. Fear coiled in his stomach as he hurried inside, locking the door behind him. Emily and Sophie were already asleep, their faces peaceful in the dim light of their room. Robert sat in the living room, staring out the window, the shadows outside playing tricks on his mind. Who was this man? And what did he want? The next day, the motorcycle was gone, but Robert couldn't shake the unease that had taken root in him. He drove cautiously, checking his mirrors constantly. His usual passengers barely registered as his mind replayed the events of the past 24 hours. By evening, the motorcycle was back. This time, the rider didn't keep his distance. As Robert drove through a quiet neighborhood, the motorcycle sped up, weaving closer to his taxi. The rider gestured for him to pull over. Robert's pulse quickened. He considered driving to a police station, but decided against it. He didn't want to escalate the situation without knowing what he was dealing with. He pulled over reluctantly, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as the motorcycle stopped behind him. The rider dismounted and approached the driver's side window, his movements deliberate. When the man removed his helmet, Robert saw a face that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. The man's sharp features and piercing gaze gave him an air of authority, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Robert Harris?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. Robert nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" The man pulled out a badge, flashing it briefly before tucking it away. "Detective Carter. I need to talk to you about Ruby and Jack. It's important." Robert's heart sank. The encounter had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and the unease in his chest deepened. What had he gotten himself into? "Step out of the car," Carter instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. As Robert unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped onto the curb, he couldn't help but feel like his world was about to be turned upside down. Whatever Carter had to say, he knew it would change everything. And so began the unraveling of a mystery that would test Robert's courage, loyalty, and determination to protect the people he cared about. The shadows of the city were closing in, and the chase was far from over. Secrets in the shadows. The cool night air nipped at Robert's face as he stood on the curb, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The detective, Carter, stood just a few feet away, his imposing figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlights. The badge had startled Robert, but it was Carter's calm yet intense demeanor that unsettled him the most. "Detective Carter," Robert began cautiously, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling within him. "What's this about? Is Ruby okay?" Carter studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Ruby and the baby are fine. For now," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But I need to ask you some questions about last night, specifically, who might have seen you take her to the hospital." Robert frowned, his confusion growing. It was late. Just me, Ruby, and maybe a few cars on the road. "Why? What's going on?" Carter glanced up and down the street, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Ruby and her husband, Jack, have been under surveillance for weeks," he said, lowering his voice. "And now, because you helped them, so are you." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Surveillance? What are you talking about? They're just an ordinary couple. She was having a baby, for God's sake. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. It's not that simple. Jack's been tied to a group we've been investigating. People who are very dangerous, very powerful. Last night wasn't a random labor emergency. Ruby might have been running for her life. Robert felt the ground shift beneath him. Running. From what? Or who? From the people Jack has been dealing with, Carter said. Smugglers, organized crime, people who don't take kindly to betrayal. We believe Jack's been cooperating with us behind their backs, and now they've caught on. Robert's head spun. The image of Jack's warm handshake and grateful smile clashed violently with the shadowy narrative Carter was painting. If that's true, why didn't he tell me? Why involve me at all? Maybe he didn't have a choice, Carter replied. Or maybe he thought you'd get them to safety without asking questions. Either way, you're part of this now. They've seen your face, and they don't forget. Robert's stomach churned. So what happens now? Am I supposed to just wait for these people to come after me? Not if I can help it, Carter said. But you need to be careful. Watch your back, stay alert, and most importantly, stay away from Ruby and Jack. The weight of Carter's words hung heavily in the air. Robert wanted to protest, to demand more answers, but before he could, Carter turned back to his motorcycle. I'll be in touch, he said over his shoulder. If anything feels off, call this number. He handed Robert a card before strapping on his helmet and riding off into the night. Robert stood frozen on the curb, the card clutched tightly in his hand. He read it under the streetlight. Detective Carter, Organized Crime Division, and a direct phone number. He tucked it into his pocket and climbed back into his taxi, his mind racing with questions. As he drove home, his paranoia grew. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of watchful eyes. Every car behind him felt like a tail. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his nerves were frayed. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, but Robert couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Inside the house, the warmth and quiet were a small comfort. He checked on Emily and Sophie, their peaceful faces a reminder of what mattered most. Whatever was happening, he had to protect them. He couldn't let this chaos touch their lives. The next morning, Robert's unease hadn't faded. He drove Emily and Sophie to school, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He dropped them off with a forced smile and a promise to pick them up later. As he returned to his usual route, his phone buzzed with a ride request. The pickup location was a nearby cafe, a place he'd stopped at dozens of times before. But when he arrived, his breath caught in his throat. Jack was there, standing near the entrance with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes darted nervously around the street as he approached the taxi. "Jack," Robert said as he rolled down the window. "What are you doing here? Carter told me to stay away from you." Jack opened the door and climbed in, his face pale and drawn. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice trembling. "Ruby and the baby are in danger. I need your help." Robert's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You lied to me, Jack, about everything. Why should I help you now?" "Because you're the only one I can trust," Jack said desperately. "Please, Robert, they're after Ruby. If we don't act fast, they'll find her." Robert hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay out of this, to let Carter handle it. But the memory of Ruby's fear and vulnerability tugged at his conscience. He sighed deeply. "Where is she?" "She's hiding at a motel on the outskirts of town," Jack said. "We need to move her before they figure out where she is." As they drove, Jack explained the situation in fragmented bursts. He had been working for a smuggling ring, moving stolen goods across state lines. But when the ring started trafficking weapons and drugs, he decided to cooperate with law enforcement. His betrayal hadn't gone unnoticed, and now the group was after him. And anyone connected to him. "I didn't mean to drag you into this," Jack said. "But when Ruby went into labor, I panicked. You were the closest driver, and I didn't know what else to do." Robert shook his head, anger simmering beneath the surface. "You should have been honest with me from the start. Now my family could be in danger too." "I know," Jack said, his voice breaking. "And I'm sorry. But please, help me get Ruby and the baby to safety. After that, I'll disappear. You'll never hear from me again." They reached the motel as dusk began to settle over the city. The rundown building sat on the edge of a quiet highway, its neon sign flickering erratically. Robert parked near the entrance, his eyes scanning the lot for any signs of trouble. Inside, Ruby was waiting in a small room with the baby cradled in her arms. She looked up as Jack entered, relief washing over her face. "You came," she whispered. Robert stood in the doorway, his heart sinking at the sight of her exhaustion. "We need to move fast," he said. "Do you have everything you need?" Ruby nodded, grabbing a small bag from the floor. "Where are we going?" Jack hesitated. "I have a friend who owes me a favor. He has a cabin in the woods, far from the city. It's the safest place I can think of." Robert helped them into the taxi, his senses on high alert. As they pulled out of the parking lot, he noticed headlights in the distance, bright and unrelenting, growing closer with every passing second. "Jack," Robert said, his voice tense, "I think we're being followed." Jack turned to look out the back window, his face paling. "It's them. They found us." Panic surged through Robert as the car behind them accelerated, closing the gap. The chase had begun, and the safety of everyone in the car rested in his hands. The quiet streets ahead twisted into a maze of uncertainty, and Robert knew there was no turning back now. High-speed reckoning. The roar of an engine pierced the quiet night as the vehicle behind them surged forward, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator locking onto prey. Robert gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. In the rearview mirror, the shadowy car loomed closer, weaving through traffic with calculated aggression. "Hold on," Robert yelled, his voice edged with panic. Ruby clutched the baby to her chest, her face pale and drawn. Jack twisted in his seat, peering through the rear window. "They're not going to let us go," he shouted. "Then they'll have to catch us first," Robert muttered, pressing his foot down on the accelerator. The taxi lurched forward, its engine groaning under the strain. The streets of the city blurred around them as Robert maneuvered through intersections, narrowly avoiding collisions. Horns blared, tires screeched, and pedestrians leaped back onto curbs as the chase intensified. "They're getting closer," Jack cried, his voice tight with fear. Robert glanced at the mirror again. The pursuing car was relentless, its driver clearly skilled at keeping up. Every time Robert thought he'd gained some distance, the vehicle would reappear, shadowing their every move. "We need a plan," Robert shouted. "If we keep going like this, they'll catch us eventually." Jack hesitated, then pointed to a side street. "Turn there. It's a construction zone. Narrow roads, lots of obstacles. It'll slow them down." Without hesitation, Robert veered into the side street, the tires skidding slightly as the taxi turned sharply. The glow of orange warning lights illuminated the path ahead, a labyrinth of barricades, potholes, and half-finished scaffolding. The pursuing car hesitated briefly before following, its headlights bobbing erratically over the uneven terrain. The taxi jolted violently as it hit a small pothole, causing Ruby to cry out. "Be careful," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm trying." Robert shot back, his focus razor-sharp. The maze of construction equipment worked in their favor. Robert navigated the narrow lanes with precision, ducking under scaffolding and swerving around barriers. The pursuing car struggled to keep up, its bulkier frame scraping against metal and concrete. But the reprieve was short-lived. The sound of a gunshot shattered the night, the echo reverberating through the empty streets. "They're shooting at us," Ruby screamed, her voice rising in terror. "Keep your head down," Robert yelled, his heart pounding. Jack ducked low, his face contorted with panic. We can't keep running like this. They'll catch us eventually, or worse. Then what do you suggest? Robert snapped, his frustration boiling over. There's an old warehouse a few blocks from here, Jack said, his voice grim. If we can lose them there, we might have a chance to double back and escape. An old warehouse? Are you serious? Robert shot him a glare. Do you have a better idea? Jack fired back. Reluctantly, Robert nodded. He swerved onto another street, following Jack's directions. The pursuing car hesitated momentarily at the intersection, giving them a precious few seconds to widen the gap. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior illuminated by flickering floodlights. Robert drove straight into the loading bay, the screech of the tires echoing in the cavernous space. He killed the engine, plunging the area into near silence. Out. Quickly, Jack hissed, grabbing the duffel bag. Rudy clutched the baby tightly as Robert helped her out of the car. The group darted into the shadows, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris. The sound of an engine roared outside, and moments later, the pursuing car screeched to a halt at the entrance. Doors slammed, and heavy footsteps echoed as multiple figures stepped into the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They're inside, Ruby whispered, her voice barely audible. Stay calm, Robert said, his tone firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. We'll find a way out of this. Jack pulled a metal pipe from a pile of discarded tools and gripped it tightly. If they find us, we fight. No, Robert said sharply. You've got Ruby and the baby to think about. Fighting's the last resort. The sound of voices carried through the warehouse, low and menacing. Spread out, one of the men ordered. They're here somewhere. Robert's mind raced. The warehouse was vast, but filled with hiding spots, old machinery, stacks of pallets, and piles of crates. They could use the terrain to their advantage. We split up, Robert whispered. I'll lead them away while you two find another exit. Once you're out, keep running and don't look back. No, Ruby protested. We're not leaving you behind. Robert placed a hand on her shoulder. You have a baby to protect. This isn't about me. It's about keeping you safe. Jack hesitated, but eventually nodded. We'll find a way out. Be careful. As Ruby and Jack slipped away into the shadows, Robert took a deep breath and crept toward the far end of the warehouse. He picked up a loose wrench from the floor and hurled it toward a stack of metal barrels. The resulting crash echoed loudly, drawing the attention of their pursuers. There, one of the men shouted. Flashlights converged on the source of the noise as Robert darted behind a pile of crates. His heart pounded in his chest as the men closed in, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Split up, another voice ordered. Check every corner. Robert held his breath, his body pressed tightly against the crates. The sound of boots on concrete grew louder, the beam of a flashlight sweeping dangerously close. As one of the men rounded the corner, Robert acted on instinct. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung it, knocking the flashlight out of the man's hand. The beam flickered wildly as it hit the ground, plunging the area into deeper darkness. The man cursed and lunged toward him, but Robert ducked and shoved him into a stack of barrels. The resulting crash reverberated through the warehouse, momentarily disorienting the other pursuers. Over here, another voice shouted, and the footsteps grew frantic. Robert didn't wait to see what happened next. He bolted toward the back of the warehouse, weaving between machinery and pallets. The exit was just ahead, a faint sliver of moonlight visible through a broken door. He burst through the door and into the cold night air, his lungs burning from exertion. The quick glance behind him confirmed that the men hadn't caught up yet, but his relief was short-lived. In the distance, he spotted Ruby and Jack running toward a wooded area on the edge of the property. A new set of headlights appeared on the horizon, heading straight for them. They're not done yet, Robert muttered, his jaw tightening. Summoning every ounce of courage, he sprinted toward Ruby and Jack, determined to protect them at all costs. The night was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. Into the woods. The cold night air stung Robert's face as he sprinted across the gravel lot, his pulse hammering in his ears. The headlights in the distance grew brighter, cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a relentless predator. Ruby and Jack were running ahead, Ruby clutching the baby tightly to her chest as Jack carried the duffel bag. The woods loomed just beyond the edge of the lot, a shadowy refuge that seemed both inviting and foreboding. "Keep moving," Robert shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. Ruby stumbled, her legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion and fear. Robert reached her side in a heartbeat, steadying her with one arm while keeping his eyes fixed on the approaching car. "We're almost there," he assured her, though his own confidence was fraying at the edges. The car skidded to a halt behind them, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel. Doors slammed, and voices barked orders as the pursuers spilled out into the lot. The sound of heavy boots crunching against the ground grew louder, sending a fresh surge of adrenaline through Robert's veins. "Into the trees," he yelled, pushing Ruby forward. They plunged into the woods, the dense canopy above swallowing them in shadows. The underbrush snagged at their clothes, and the uneven terrain made every step a challenge. Robert glanced back briefly and saw flashlights bobbing in the distance, the beams slicing through the darkness like spears. "We need to split up," Jack panted, his voice strained. "If we stay together, they'll catch all of us." "No way," Robert shot back. "We stick together. We're safer that way." Jack hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The group pressed on, the sounds of pursuit growing closer with every passing second. The woods seemed endless, a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled roots. Robert's mind raced, searching for a plan, a way out. His instincts screamed at him to keep moving, but he knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers forever. "There's a creek up ahead," Jack said suddenly, his voice low but urgent. "If we follow it, we can mask our tracks." Robert nodded, guiding Ruby toward the faint sound of rushing water. The creek was narrow but swift, its icy water reflecting the faint light of the moon. Without hesitation, they waded into the current, the cold biting into their legs as they moved upstream. The water muffled their movements, but it also slowed them down. Ruby's breaths came in ragged gasps as she clutched the baby, her strength waning with every step. I can't keep going," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have to," Robert said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Just a little further. We'll find a place to rest." Ahead, the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by thick underbrush. Robert motioned for them to stop, crouching low behind a fallen log. The flashlights in the distance flickered through the trees, the voices of the pursuers faint but persistent. "Stay quiet," Robert whispered. "They'll pass us if we're lucky." Ruby huddled close to Jack, her arms wrapped protectively around the baby. Robert gripped a sturdy branch he'd picked up along the way, his heart pounding as the flashlights drew closer. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. The sound of boots crunching on leaves grew louder, then stopped. Robert held his breath, straining to hear. "Anything," a voice called out. "Nothing yet," another replied. "They can't have gotten far. Keep looking." The beams of light danced across the underbrush, coming dangerously close to their hiding spot. Robert tightened his grip on the branch, ready to fight if necessary. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the flashlights moved on, the voices fading into the distance. Robert exhaled slowly, his muscles unclenching as the immediate danger passed. "They're still looking for us," Jack said, his voice low. "We can't stay here." "I know," Robert replied, "but Ruby needs to rest. 5 minutes, and then we move." Ruby nodded weakly, her face pale and drawn. She leaned against Jack, her eyes fluttering closed as she tried to catch her breath. Robert stood guard, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The woods were eerily silent, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures drowned out by the tension that hung in the air. "Why didn't you tell me the truth earlier?" Robert asked Jack quietly, his voice laced with frustration. "If I'd known what we were up against, I could have been prepared." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to drag you into this. Ruby and I thought we could handle it on our own. But when things started spiraling out of control, I didn't have a choice. And now we're all running for our lives," Robert muttered. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I never meant for any of this to happen. But I swear, if we make it out of this, I'll fix everything." Robert didn't respond. His focus was on the task at hand, getting Ruby and the baby to safety. The time for anger and recriminations would come later. After a few minutes, Ruby stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Robert helped her to her feet, and the group resumed their trek through the woods. The creek provided a natural guide, its winding path leading them deeper into the wilderness. The flashlights and voices had faded entirely, but Robert knew better than to assume they were safe. Hours seemed to pass as they trudged through the darkness, their steps growing heavier with each mile. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they stumbled upon an old cabin tucked away in a clearing. Jack's face lit up with recognition. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with relief. "This is the place." The cabin was small and weathered, its wooden exterior worn by years of neglect. But it was shelter, and for now, that was enough. Robert helped Ruby inside, settling her onto a makeshift cot. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft cry that Ruby quickly soothed. Jack bolted the door and peered through the window. "We'll be safe here for a while," he said. "At least long enough to come up with a plan." Robert nodded, though his mind was already racing. The events of the night had pushed him to his limits, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The men chasing them wouldn't give up so easily, and the cabin was only a temporary refuge. As the first rays of sunlight bathed the clearing, Robert sat by the window, his grip on the makeshift weapon tightening. He had promised to protect Ruby and the baby, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. The final stand. The first light of dawn painted the cabin in a soft golden hue, but the beauty of the morning did little to soothe Robert's racing mind. He sat near the window, his eyes scanning the dense woods surrounding their temporary refuge. The stillness felt deceptive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Ruby slept on the makeshift cot, the baby cradled securely in her arms. Jack paced the room, glancing out the window every few minutes. His tension was palpable, each step a manifestation of the storm brewing inside him. "They'll find us eventually," Jack said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but his words carried the weight of grim certainty. "They always do." Robert leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the window frame. "Then we make sure we're ready for them. I didn't come this far to let them win." Jack stopped pacing and looked at Robert, his expression conflicted. "You've already done more than I had any right to ask. You don't have to stay." Robert shot him a sharp look. "You think I'd walk away now, after everything?" "Forget it." Jack nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I appreciate it. More than you know." The quiet was interrupted by a distant sound, a faint rumble, growing louder with each passing second. Robert's eyes narrowed as he strained to listen. "They're coming," he said, his voice low and steady. Jack grabbed the duffel bag and unzipped it, revealing its contents: a few bundles of cash, some documents, and a small handgun. He handed the weapon to Robert, who hesitated for only a moment before taking it. "I hate guns," Robert muttered, checking the safety. "But I hate the idea of not protecting them more." Jack armed himself with a second weapon and moved to the door. "They'll expect us to hide," he said. "We can use that against them." Robert nodded, formulating a plan in his head. "I'll draw their attention. You stay with Ruby and the baby. If things go south, take them and run. I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Jack argued. Robert turned to him, his expression hard. This isn't about pride or bravery. It's about keeping them safe. You've got the better chance of getting them out of here. So that's what you're going to do. Jack hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Just don't get yourself killed. No promises, Robert said with a grim smile. The rumble grew into a deafening roar as two SUVs burst through the tree line, their engines growling like beasts. Men poured out of the vehicles, their movements efficient and coordinated. They were armed, their dark clothing blending seamlessly with the shadows of the forest. Robert crouched near the window, his heart pounding as he watched the men fan out. They moved with precision, their leader barking orders as they surrounded the cabin. "Stay inside," Robert whispered to Ruby, who had woken and now clutched the baby tightly. "No matter what happens, don't come out." Ruby's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Be careful." Robert slipped out through the back door, moving quietly as he circled around the cabin. The woods provided cover, the thick underbrush muffling his steps. He could see the men closing in, their weapons raised as they approached the front door. He aimed the handgun at a tree near the group and fired. The gunshot cracked through the air, startling the men and sending birds scattering into the sky. "There!" one of them shouted, spinning toward the sound. Robert fired again, deliberately missing but drawing their attention. The men shouted to each other, their formation breaking as they turned toward the perceived threat. Using the chaos to his advantage, Robert moved deeper into the woods, leading a portion of the group away from the cabin. He could hear their shouts and footsteps as they followed, their movements frantic and disorganized. "Split up," one of them barked. "He can't be far." Robert's heart raced as he darted behind a fallen log, his breathing ragged. He peeked over the edge, spotting one of the men moving cautiously through the underbrush. The man was close, too close. Robert waited, his grip tightening on the handgun. As the man stepped closer, Robert lunged, striking him with the butt of the weapon. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Robert grabbed the man's radio and stuffed it into his pocket. He knew it was only a matter of time before the others regrouped, and he needed to stay ahead of them. Back at the cabin, Jack watched through a crack in the door as the remaining men moved closer. He could feel the tension in the air, each second stretching into an eternity. Ruby huddled in the corner, her hands trembling as she rocked the baby. Jack took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He opened the door just enough to fire a warning shot, forcing the men to take cover. "We're not going down without a fight," Jack shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. Meanwhile, Robert continued to lead the rest of the group deeper into the woods. He used the terrain to his advantage, doubling back and setting small traps with fallen branches and loose rocks. The men's frustration grew, their shouts becoming more aggressive as they struggled to track him. One of the men finally caught up, his flashlight beams sweeping across the trees. Robert crouched behind a boulder, waiting for the right moment. As the man stepped closer, Robert sprang forward, knocking the flashlight from his hand and delivering a swift blow to his stomach. The man fell to his knees, gasping for air. Robert grabbed the man's radio and spoke into it, his voice calm and deliberate. "Leave now, or you'll regret staying." The response was immediate, a burst of static followed by angry shouts. "Who is this? What do you want?" Robert didn't reply. He smashed the radio against a rock and disappeared into the shadows. Back at the cabin, the men outside were growing impatient. They regrouped, their leader shouting commands to prepare for an assault. Jack and Ruby exchanged a tense look, both understanding the gravity of the situation. But before the attackers could make their move, the sound of sirens filled the air. Flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance, and the men froze, their plans unraveling. Robert emerged from the woods, bruised but determined. He had used the radio to contact Detective Carter, providing just enough information to bring reinforcements. The men hesitated, their confidence faltering as the police closed in. Some attempted to flee, but the officers were quick to intercept them. Carter approached the cabin, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Is everyone all right?" he asked. Jack nodded, his arm around Ruby. "Thanks to Robert." Carter turned to Robert, his gaze steady. "You did good," he said. "But this isn't over. We'll make sure these guys are dealt with, but you and your family should lay low for a while." Robert nodded, exhaustion washing over him. As long as they're safe, that's all that matters. As the sun rose higher, painting the clearing in warm light, the nightmare finally seemed to be over. Ruby and Jack packed their belongings, ready to disappear and start anew. Robert watched them go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He returned home later that day, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. Emily and Sophie greeted him with hugs, their innocent smiles a reminder of why he had fought so hard. Life would go on, and Robert knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing he had done everything he could to protect the people who needed him most. The final stand. The sunlight filtered through the dense forest as the last of the armed men were rounded up by law enforcement. Their resistance was short-lived, overwhelmed by the swift response of Detective Carter and his team. The once terrifying threat was now a line of handcuffed figures being led to waiting police vehicles, their weapons confiscated and their plans dismantled. Robert stood near the cabin, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Ruby and Jack huddled nearby, clutching the baby tightly. The baby had fallen asleep despite the chaos, its soft breathing a calming presence amidst the storm. Detective Carter approached Robert, a rare look of respect softening his normally stern features. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Not many people would have done what you did." Robert shook his head, brushing off the compliment. "I didn't do it for praise. I did it because I couldn't stand by and let them suffer." Carter nodded, understanding. "It's over for now. But these people have far-reaching connections. Jack and Ruby will need to disappear for a while, and you might want to consider the same." Robert glanced at Ruby, her tired face brightening slightly at the sight of her baby's peaceful slumber. He looked back at Carter. "They're the priority. Get them somewhere safe." Carter gestured toward one of the police cars. "We've got a secure location lined up. They'll be taken care of. What about you?" Robert sighed, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. "I've got 2 daughters who need their dad. Running isn't an option." Carter frowned but didn't argue. "Then stay vigilant. I'll make sure someone keeps an eye on your family." A final goodbye. The air was heavy with unspoken words as Robert, Ruby, and Jack stood near the edge of the clearing. A police SUV waited nearby, ready to whisk the couple and their baby away to safety. Jack extended his hand to Robert, his grip firm but laced with gratitude. "Thank you," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to help us, but you did. I'll never forget that." Robert met his gaze. "Just make sure this was worth it. Keep them safe." Ruby stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life. My baby's life." Robert smiled faintly. "Just live a good life. That'll be thanks enough." As the SUV pulled away, Robert watched it disappear down the dirt road, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over him. The fight was over, but the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain. Returning home. When Robert arrived home later that afternoon, the familiar sight of his modest house brought a sense of grounding. Emily and Sophie ran out to greet him, their laughter cutting through the lingering tension in his heart. "Dad," Sophie exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. "You're home." Emily hummed back slightly, her sharp eyes noticing the scratches on his arms and the weariness in his face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Robert knelt down, pulling both girls into a hug. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "Just had a rough couple of days." As they settled into the house, Robert found solace in the ordinary chaos of their lives. Sophie chattering excitedly about her school play, Emily quietly working on her homework, The warmth of their presence was a reminder of what he had fought for, what he would always fight for. A ripple of kindness. Over the next few weeks, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The city moved on, its rhythm unchanged despite the turmoil Robert had experienced. But Robert himself was not the same. One afternoon, he found himself driving past a shelter for families in need. He pulled over, a thought forming in his mind. He stepped inside and spoke with the staff, offering to drive residents to appointments or errands for free. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way to pay forward the kindness and second chances he had been given. Closure and hope. Months later, Robert received an unexpected letter. It had no return address, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Ruby and Jack. Inside was a picture of their baby, now smiling and healthy, with a short note. "Dear Robert, we're safe, thanks to you. You gave us a chance to rebuild our lives, and we'll never forget it. One day, we hope to repay the kindness you showed us. Until then, know that you're in our hearts. With love, Ruby, Jack, and Ella." Robert held the letter for a long time, a quiet smile on his face. He tucked it into a drawer, a reminder of the impact one choice could have. Life wasn't perfect, but it was meaningful. Robert had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty, but through it all, he had stayed true to his values. And as he watched Emily and Sophie play in the yard, their laughter filling the air, he knew that he would face whatever came next with the same unwavering resolve. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Robert felt hopeful, ready to embrace whatever life had in store.